For a little while, Bobby Tolan looked like one of the players who might help define the 1970s in Cincinnati. He could hit, he could run, he could cover center field. In 1970, he batted .316, drove in 80 runs, and led the National League with 57 stolen bases, right in the middle of a Reds team that was starting to become something larger than itself. He had already won a World Series ring in St. Louis. He had October experience. He had prime years still in front of him. Then the story bent. An injury cost him a season. A comeback carried him back to the World Series. And one hard October afternoon helped change how his name would be remembered. Bobby Tolan was never just a footnote, but somehow history made him feel like one. In the first inning of Game 7, Bobby Tolan was standing in center field with the whole season balanced over his head. Cincinnati and Oakland, October of 1972. A World Series that had been tight, strange, and tense from the beginning. The Reds were at home, with one more game to turn another pennant into a championship. They had Johnny Bench, they had Pete Rose, they had Tony Perez. They had a team that was already becoming something larger than a roster, and they had Bobby Tolan in center. Angel Mangual hit a ball his way in the first inning, and Tolan misplayed it. It became a 3-base error. Oakland scored its first run of the game. Later, in the 6th, Sal Bando drove a ball toward the base of the center field wall. Tolan looked like he had a chance at it, but the ball fell for a double. He later said his hamstring tightened, and that it kept him from making the play. The Athletics won 3-2. That is the kind of game baseball remembers unfairly, not because the memory is false, but because it is incomplete. One afternoon can harden around a player's name. One play can become louder than years of work. Tolan apologized to his teammates in the locker room after the loss, and that detail has always carried a particular weight. Not scandal, not disgrace, just the old baseball ache of being close enough to touch something and watching it get away. But if that is the only image left of Bobby Tolan, then the story has been flattened, because the man in center field that day was not some spare part who wandered into history.
He had been one of the reasons Cincinnati was there. He had been a .300 hitter, a stolen base champion, a World Series player, a comeback story, and for a brief period, one of the most complete outfielders in the National League. So the real question is not just what happened in Game 7. The real question is how a player that good, on teams that memorable, could become so easy to overlook. Before Bobby Tolan became a Cincinnati Red, he was a young outfielder trying to find space on one of the best teams in baseball. He came up with the St. Louis Cardinals in 1965, still a teenager, a left-handed hitter and left-handed thrower from Los Angeles. But the Cardinals of that period were not a club with empty jobs waiting around. They were a winning team, and Tolan was mostly a reserve outfielder. That matters, because sometimes the first version of a career depends less on talent than opportunity. In St. Louis, Tolan was part of winning baseball, but he was not yet being asked to carry much of it. He was with the Cardinals when they won the 1967 World Series. He was also there in 1968, when St. Louis won the National League pennant again, then lost to the Detroit Tigers in 7 games after leading the series 3-1. Tolan had already seen October from the inside. He had already learned what the best teams felt like up close. But he was still waiting for the kind of role that tells a player what he really is. Then came the trade. After the 1968 season, St. Louis sent Bobby Tolan and reliever Wayne Granger to the Cincinnati Reds for Vada Pinson. Pinson was a veteran outfielder, an established name. For the Cardinals, the deal was about adding proven offense. For Tolan, it became something else entirely. It became the opening. Cincinnati was not yet the fully formed Big Red machine that fans remember from the middle of the 1970s. That version would come later,
with Joe Morgan and the championships and the feeling of inevitability. But the foundation was already there. Pete Rose was there. Johnny Bench was there. Tony Perez was there. The Reds were dangerous, and they were still becoming. Tolan arrived at the exact moment when a gifted player could change the shape of his career.
The question was whether the bat, the speed, and the glove would hold up when he finally played every day. In 1969, Cincinnati found out. Bobby Tolan became the Reds' regular center fielder, and he did not simply fill the position. He broke through. Hitting near the top of the lineup, often second behind Pete Rose and in front of Alex Johnson, Tolan gave Cincinnati a left-handed presence with motion, pressure, and real damage in the bat. He hit .305. He drove in 93 runs. He hit 21 home runs, the most he would ever hit in a major league season. Those are not background numbers. Those are the numbers of a player who had stepped into a bigger room and looked like he belonged there. He finished with 302 total bases, 7th in the National League. He hit 10 triples, 3rd in the league. He had enough speed to stretch the field and enough pop to punish mistakes. And this was not happening in a quiet corner of baseball. The sport had just entered the era of divisional play. The National League West was new. The map of the pennant race had changed. Cincinnati finished 3rd in 1969, 4 games behind the Atlanta Braves, but the Reds were close enough for people to feel something forming. That is the part that gets lost when dynasties are remembered only by their championships. Before a team becomes famous, it has seasons like this. Seasons where the pieces start to announce themselves. Seasons where a player like Bobby Tolan stops being a former reserve and starts looking like part of the answer. And that is where his story becomes more complicated. Because 1969 was not a fluke. It was not a single hot summer that disappeared when the league adjusted. The next season, Tolan did something even more convincing. He turned promise into peak. In 1970, Bobby Tolan looked like a star. He hit .316, the best batting average of his career. He added 16 home runs and 80 RBIs. He hit 34 doubles. And then he did something that placed him directly into the National League record of that season. He led the league with 57 stolen bases. That detail tells you something about the player and the time. In those years, stolen bases in the National League belonged more often than not to Lou Brock. Brock was the standard, the name everyone expected. But in 1970, it was Bobby Tolan who finished on top. For Cincinnati, that meant the lineup had another kind of weapon. Tolan was not just getting hits, he was forcing pitchers, catchers, and infielders to account for him. He could hit second, move the game, drive the ball, run, and cover center field. He gave the Reds balance. He gave them pressure. And the Reds won. They captured the National League West and reached the postseason for the first time since the 1961 World Series. Against the Pittsburgh Pirates in the NLCS, Cincinnati swept the series in 3 games. In Game 2, Tolan scored all 3 Reds runs in a 3-1 victory. He even homered off Luke Walker in the 5th inning. That is the kind of postseason performance that should stick in a franchise's memory. Not as trivia, as evidence. The Reds were not yet the later championship machine, but they were already winning big games, and Bobby Tolan was right in the middle of it. Then came the World Series against the Baltimore Orioles. Baltimore won in 5 games, and Cincinnati had to live with the difference between winning the pennant and finishing the job. Tolan went 4 for 19 in the series and hit a home run off Mike Cuellar in Game 2. It was not enough to change the outcome, but it added another October line to a resume that was starting to look substantial. By the end of 1970, Bobby Tolan was 25 years old. He had a World Series ring from St. Louis, a pennant with Cincinnati, a league stolen base title, a .316 season, and a central role on one of the most exciting young teams in baseball. For a player like that,
The next question should have been how high the ceiling went. Instead, the next season vanished. Tolan missed all of 1971 after rupturing his Achilles tendon while playing basketball. The injury was serious enough on its own, but it came with another layer because playing basketball violated a specific clause in his contract. So the injury was not only physical, it also became part of the relationship between player and organization. There is no need to overstate it. An Achilles injury is enough. For a player whose game relied on speed, movement, and range, it was a brutal interruption at exactly the wrong time. He had just had the best season of his career.
He had just led the league in stolen bases. He was not an aging player trying to hang on. He was supposed to be entering the heart of his prime. Baseball careers can change in obvious ways, with a trade, a benching, a bad season. But sometimes they change in a quiet off-season moment, away from the ballpark, before anyone in the stands knows what has happened. The Reds played 1971 without him. And when a player loses a full year, he does not just lose the games. He loses rhythm. He loses accumulation. He loses the natural next step that everyone assumed was coming. The team keeps moving. The league keeps moving. The player has to come back not to the place he left, but to the place baseball has become without him. That is what made 1972 so important. Tolan was not just trying to return. He was trying to prove that the 1970 version of himself had not disappeared for good. And for much of that season, he did. In 1972, Bobby Tolan came back and hit .283. He drove in 82 runs. He stole 42 bases. For a man returning from a ruptured Achilles tendon, those numbers mattered. They were not just statistics. They were evidence of usefulness, durability, and stubborn recovery. Baseball noticed. Tolan won Comeback Player of the Year. He also won the Hutch Award. At the time, that combination placed him in rare company. He became only the second player to win both the Hutch Award and his league's Comeback Player of the Year award, and the first to do it in the same season. That should have been the headline of his career. A player peaks, gets hurt, loses a year, then comes back to help a pennant contender return to October. There is a clean version of this story, where 1972 becomes the proof of everything good about Bobby Tolan. And in many ways, it was. The Reds won the NL West again. They met Pittsburgh again in the NLCS. This time, the series carried one of those old postseason moments that still feels like it belongs to another baseball century. Cincinnati entered the ninth inning of the deciding game trailing by a run, then came back. The winning run scored on a wild pitch by Bob Moose. The Reds were going back to the World Series. For Tolan, it meant the comeback had reached its fullest stage. He was not just healthy enough to play.
He was back in center field for the National League champions, back under the lights, back on the stage where careers are remembered differently. But baseball rarely gives a player a story without a shadow. The 1972 World Series against Oakland went 7 games. It was close enough that a play, a bounce, a tightened hamstring, or a misread ball could become part of the final accounting. And that is what happened to Tolan in Game 7. The 3-base error on Mangual, the Bando double that fell, the 3-2 loss, the apology afterward. A player can spend 6 months building a comeback, then have the last day of the season become the sentence people remember. That is not fair, exactly, but October has never been built around fairness. October edits careers down to images. For Bobby Tolan, 1972 became both a triumph and a burden. And the next year, the burden seemed to grow heavier. In 1973, everything changed. Tolan's batting average fell to .206. The player who had hit .316 in 1970
The player who had come back with 82 RBIs in 1972 suddenly looked far removed from his best version. And at the same time, his relationship with Reds management was deteriorating. The source record describes it plainly. Tolan had several squabbles with management. The Reds were still unhappy about the basketball injury from 1971. In August, he went AWOL for 2 days. He also broke team rules by growing a beard. On September 27, Cincinnati suspended him for the remainder of the season. That suspension mattered immediately. The Reds won another division title, but Tolan missed the NLCS against the New York Mets. Cincinnati lost that series. By then, the partnership between Tolan and the Reds had run out of road. After the season, Cincinnati traded him to the San Diego Padres, along with Dave Tomlin, for pitcher Clay Kirby. It is easy from a distance to reduce that year to conflict, but the deeper baseball meaning is about timing and fit. Tolan had been an important player for Cincinnati when the Reds were rising. He had helped them win pennants in 1970 and 1972. He had given them speed, defense, left-handed hitting, and real postseason value. But by the end of 1973, the organization was moving toward its final championship form, and Tolan was no longer part of the plan.
That is the turn that makes his career feel off-script. Because the Reds were not fading. They were about to become immortal. Bobby Tolan had been there while the machine was being built, but just before it became the big red machine everyone remembers, he was gone. San Diego was not Cincinnati. That was the first reality of the next part of Bobby Tolan's career. He was going from a contender with October expectations to a Padres club still trying to find its place in the National League. The uniform changed, the ballpark changed, the stakes changed, but Tolan was still a major league player. In 1974, he appeared in 95 games for San Diego and hit .266. It was not the Tolan of 1970, but it was not the end either. He was still on the field, still trying to make the next version of his career work. And during that season, another piece of the Cincinnati story followed him west. After the trade, the Major League Baseball Players Association had filed a grievance on Tolan's behalf. In 1974, he learned that he had won it. According to the source, Tolan wanted the Reds to publicly apologize because he believed his name had been slandered. That apology never came. That detail matters because it shows how the split with Cincinnati did not simply vanish once he put on another uniform. Sometimes a player leaves a team, but the argument keeps traveling with him. The box scores move forward, but the old season is still there in the background. In 1975, Tolan hit .255 for San Diego. After that season, the Padres released him. By then, the Reds had become the team history remembers. Cincinnati won the 1975 World Series against the Boston Red Sox. Then the Reds won it again in 1976, sweeping the Yankees. Those teams became permanent baseball language. The big red machine. Bench, Rose, Morgan, Perez, Concepcion, Fister, Griffey, Sparky Anderson. And Bobby Tolan was no longer in the picture. That is one of the quiet cruelties of baseball memory. It often rewards the players who are there when the parade finally happens. Tolan had been there for the climb. He had been there when Cincinnati won the West in 1970. He had been there for the 1970 pennant. He had been there for the 1972 pennant. He had been there when the Reds were still trying to cross the last few feet. But he was gone when they finally crossed them. So when fans look back at the Dynasty, his name does not always come up first. Sometimes it does not come up at all. Not because he was unimportant, but because he belonged to the prologue of a famous story, and prologues are easy to skip. Still, baseball gave him a few more turns. In 1976, Tolan signed with the Philadelphia Phillies. By then, he was no longer being asked to be the engine of a lineup.
He was a part-time outfielder, a veteran piece on a team trying to do something it had not done in a long time. The Phillies won the National League East that year, reaching the postseason for the first time since the Whiz Kids of 1950 were swept by the Yankees in the World Series. For Philadelphia fans, that mattered. It meant the franchise was back in October after a long wait. For Tolan, it meant another postseason doorway, and on the other side of it stood Cincinnati. The Reds beat the Phillies in the 1976 NLCS. Tolan had found his way back to October, but the team that blocked the road was the one he had helped lift earlier in the decade. There is no need to force symbolism onto that. Baseball supplied enough on its own. After Philadelphia, the career became a series of shorter stops. He was released by the Phillies in May of 1977, signed with the Pittsburgh Pirates in June, and became a free agent after the season. In 1978, he played in Japan for the Nankai Hawks. In 1979, he returned briefly to the San Diego Padres. His final major league game came on September 19, 1979. There was no grand farewell attached to it. Most baseball careers do not end with ceremony. They end with a transaction, a final appearance, a line in a register, and then the sport keeps going. Bobby Tolan finished with 1,282 major league games. He had 1,121 hits, 86 home runs, 497 runs batted in, and a .265 career batting average. He stole 193 bases. He played for 5 major league teams: the Cardinals, Reds, Padres, Phillies, and Pirates. He won 1 World Series ring with St. Louis. He played in multiple World Series. He led the National League in stolen bases. He won comeback honors after a serious injury. Those are not the numbers of a Hall of Famer. The Hall of Fame measurements are clear about that.
His career WAR, JAWS, and traditional Hall indicators sit far below the average Cooperstown center fielder. But not every baseball life should be judged only by the distance from Cooperstown. Some careers matter because they tell us what the edge of greatness looks like. Not the center of it, the edge. The place where talent, timing, health, opportunity, and memory all have to line up, and 1 or 2 of them do not. Tolan had the talent. For a few seasons, he had the opportunity. In 1969 and 1970, he looked like a player whose name might sit comfortably beside the biggest names in Cincinnati's rise. Then came the injury. Then came the comeback. Then came Game 7. Then came 1973. Then came the trade. Nothing in that chain erases what came before it, but it changed how the story was remembered. After his playing days, Tolan stayed in baseball. He coached for the Padres from 1980 through 1983. During the 1981 strike, he was sent to Walla Walla, Washington, where he became Tony Gwynn's first hitting coach. That is one of those details that almost stops the story in its tracks. Tony Gwynn became one of the purest hitters the game has ever seen, a San Diego icon, a Hall of Famer, a name that means something permanent to anyone who loves batting averages, opposite field singles, and the craft of hitting. And there, early in Gwynn's professional life, was Bobby Tolan. Not as the star of the story anymore, as a teacher. That does not make Tolan responsible for everything Tony Gwynn became. Baseball does not work that neatly. But it does remind us that a player's value can keep moving through the game after the last at-bat. Sometimes influence becomes quieter. Sometimes it leaves the box score and enters the batting cage. Tolan also became player-manager of the St. Petersburg Pelicans in the Senior Professional Baseball Association during the league's 2 seasons, 1989 and 1990. It was a different stage, a different kind of baseball, but it kept him connected to the rhythms he had known since the 1960s. His family remained tied to sports too. His cousin Eddie Tolan had been an Olympic sprinter, winning 2 gold medals in 1932. His son, Robbie Tolan, played professional baseball in the Washington Nationals organization.
And then Robbie's own career was altered by something far outside the normal heartbreaks of baseball. On December 31st, 2008, Robbie Tolan was shot by a Bel Air, Texas police officer who was allegedly investigating reports of a stolen car after a confrontation in the Tolan driveway. Robbie was unarmed and driving his own vehicle. The bullet lodged in his liver, and the source says the injury may have ended his professional baseball career. The source material notes that an investigation was ongoing as of January 2009, so the later legal resolution needs verification before being treated as complete. But even with that limitation, the fact itself belongs here carefully because it shows how the Tolan name carried another painful turn connected to baseball promise and the sudden interruption of possibility. Bobby Tolan's story is not just a list of teams and batting averages. It is a study in how careers are shaped by moments that do not ask permission. A trade opened the door. A breakout season changed his standing. A stolen base title placed him among the best in the league. An Achilles injury took away a year. A comeback restored his name. A World Series game attached a hard memory to it. A conflict with management helped push him out of Cincinnati. And then history, with its usual cold efficiency, moved the spotlight a few feet away. The strange thing is that if you freeze Bobby Tolan's career at the end of 1970, it looks like the beginning of something much bigger. A 25-year-old center fielder hitting .316, leading the league in stolen bases, driving in runs, hitting for power, playing for a rising Cincinnati team, and already carrying World Series experience. That version of the story feels like it should continue upward. But baseball is rarely that obedient. By the time the Reds became immortal, Tolan was elsewhere. By the time fans began telling the Big Red Machine story in shorthand, his role had become harder to see. He was not Bench with the crouch and the home runs. He was not Rose with the hits and the headfirst slides. He was not Morgan with the elbow pump and the complete second base game. He was not Perez driving in runs at the heart of the order. He was Bobby Tolan, the center fielder who helped bridge the Reds from dangerous to dominant. That should be enough to remember, because teams do not become dynasties all at once. They are built through seasons that almost work, players who fill vital roles, pennants that end in disappointment, and lessons that only later look like stepping stones. Tolan was part of that. He was not a bystander to Cincinnati history. He was in the lineup while it was being made. And that is why one World Series game should not be allowed to swallow the rest of his career. Yes, Game 7 happened. The error happened. The Bando double happened. The Reds lost by 1 run. Tolan apologized afterward. Those facts are part of the record. But so is 1970. So is the stolen base title. So is the 3.16 average. So is scoring all 3 runs in an NLCS victory. So is coming back from a ruptured Achilles tendon to drive in 82 runs and steal 42 bases. So is the Comeback Player of the Year award. So is the Hutch Award. So is the fact that he stayed in baseball long enough to become Tony Gwynn's first hitting coach. A career is not one frame. It is film. And when you let Bobby Tolan's career run from beginning to end, the picture becomes more generous and more interesting than the shorthand. He was not a failed star. He was a gifted player whose best years came at a fragile time, when the Reds were close but not finished, when his body had to recover from a serious injury, when one October afternoon could change the way people talked about him, and when history was about to remember Cincinnati through the men who were still there in 1975 and 1976. That is the lesson inside his story. Baseball does not only separate the great from the ordinary, it also separates the remembered from the misplaced. Sometimes the distance between those two groups is a championship won after you leave, an injury at the wrong age, a trade at the wrong time, or a single game that stays louder than it should. Bobby Tolan deserves to be remembered because he helped build something that became larger than him. He was a World Series champion
a pennant winner, a league leader, a comeback story, and a player whose career shows how close lasting fame can come before it slips just out of reach. He did not disappear because he did not matter.
He faded because baseball history often remembers the finished monument better than the hands that helped raise it.